Now, according to the Crawford School of Economics, since 2000, China-Africa trade has grown at an average annual rate of 33.5%. What are the other issues at play and what next for the two continents when it comes to trade? Well, to unpack this, I'm joined by Dr. Philani Mthembu in South Africa. He's the Executive Director of the Institute for Global Dialogue. And Patrick Anam, he's a policy analyst at Development Reimagined, joining us from Kenya. Dr. Mthembu, perhaps I'll start with you. What's the intersection between politics, resources and trade when it comes to China-Africa relations?
Well, I think politics plays a key driver, similar to all sort of engagements with external powers. What China, I think, has been quite good at and strategic at is actually, if we go back to around the year 2000, when China inaugurates the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. That was right at the time when the EU was also inaugurating its summit, but it was also at a time, I think, when Africa was largely seen by external actors, particularly actors in the West, as a continent that is largely a recipient of international development cooperation, rather than a profitable and a win-win sort of partner that China could actually, and other countries could benefit from. So they've been quite good at merging sort of summit diplomacy, engaging directly with political stakeholders within Africa, outlining key principles within South-South cooperation and the non-interference in domestic affairs, and then using that as a foundation to then build economic and social relations. So we've seen this relationship evolving quite interestingly in the past 2 decades or so.
All right, Mr. Anam, when it comes to you as the continent, should we be expecting beyond the monetary benefits of trade, things like productivity growth and technology absorption from our interaction and trade with China?
Thank you. Yeah, building up from what Dr. Philani has just commented on. So for the past 20 years, there's been this relationship between China and African countries. And to be certain, the relationship has largely been bilateral, so that whereas China has been having meetings with through FOCAC with the African leaders and countries and under singular summits every so often, most of the trade deals and negotiations have been happening on a bilateral level. And so what underlines it currently is obviously the trade that is going on to, the exports that African countries are exporting to China. But increasingly over the period that FOCAC has been in existence, we've seen a sort of development from just mere trade to now moving into infrastructure, and not only the hard infrastructure, but also we are looking at digital infrastructure, because China is now being very influential on the continent in terms of technological investments. For Kenya, for instance, we have the Huawei, which is, a major player in the telecommunication sector. We are also seeing China moving into other hydroelectric power projects. We are seeing China moving into other, export productivity oriented relationships, whereby we are seeing state-owned enterprises being established on the continent to export some goods to China. So yes, to answer your question, beyond the trade that has been going on, we are now seeing a metamorphosis into other issues like digital trade. When you look at the recent FOCAC meeting in Dakar, for instance, there was emphasis on environment. There was emphasis on climate change. There was emphasis on China's Vision 2035 and how that can be used also to merge with Africa's Agenda 2063.
Okay.
And there's also emphasis on China investing on other soft issues like public health sector. So I think there's been a transformation, but largely it's been underlined by trade.
All right. Dr. Mthembu, to come back to you, how important is it to have balanced trade between the continents? Because we see now that there is quite a large deficit. Do you think that we will see this closing anytime soon? And then also, what role does the Africa Continental Free Trade Area play in perhaps closing this gap?
The Continental Free Trade Area plays a critical role in actually closing that gap, because what it will also seek to address, besides opening up the African market, is to also create the support measures for the development of regional value chains. And that means Africa as a continent, rather than in trading in raw materials, would then have to set up regional value chains that are able to actually beneficiate the products that the continent is producing. So it becomes absolutely critical that Africa, as it continues to strengthen its relations with China, also looks at the composition of its trade with China. We know that as a continent, our population will double by 2050 to above 2 billion. We know that we've got a relatively young population on the continent, which in effect gets younger as we go forward, in contrast with other developed regions which are actually aging. So we know that we have to create jobs on the continent. We know that we have to create educational opportunities. We have to create services that actually service these young people. So the Continental Free Trade Area plays a catalytic role in terms of enhancing Africa's regional cooperation and regional integration, but also the establishment of regional value chains. Mm-hmm. And what then becomes important is that for the continent to engage with China in the development of those regional value chains, so that even when Chinese enterprises are looking at Africa as a market, they understand that they can actually produce their goods and services closer to the market and reduce their costs, whilst also using the continent's strategic geographic location to also access markets in Asia, in the Middle East, and also in the Americas and Europe.
All right, as we wrap up, Mr. Anam, there's been much made of the challenges when it comes to the China-Africa trade relations. Some people saying it's not a fair one and China is trying to recolonize Africa. The Observer Research Foundation says, and I'm going to quote them now, if Chinese demand for raw materials rises too steeply, it may trigger an increase in world market prices and it may bring harm to certain African nations such as Morocco, Ethiopia, that are net importers of raw materials. How much weight should we give to the concerns that people have about their relationships and an example like that?
Thank you. I think there've been a lot of discussions around the role of China and what potentially it implies, whether it is just an act of resource extraction or whether it is a more meaningful trade relationship. What I would say is that I think a lot depends on what African countries would want from this relationship, just like what African countries would and have wanted between them and other relationship with the West and let's say EU and the US. And I think at this point in time, they've been, we've had FOCAC for over 20 years. And when you look at the history of FOCAC, this was an initiative which was triggered by the need, by the call of African countries, as it were. And so I think going forward, what is important is that Africans need to redefine this relationship. They need to redefine what is it that they want from the relationship that they're having with China. And for instance, I may give you an example of the extractives industry. The earlier report indicated correctly so that, Angola, DRC, and South Africa are among the countries with the highest export value to China. This is simply because the trade from these countries are based on minerals. But now it is incumbent upon African countries to programmatize what is already in the continental frameworks, which includes things like Africa Mining Vision. so that how does the continent want to deal with the continent's minerals, for instance?
Mr. Anam, my apologies, I need to cut you off there. We have run out of time in the segment, and my apologies for doing it so abruptly. Thank you to you, Dr. Philani Mthembu, who's Executive Director at the Institute for Global Dialogue, and Patrick Anam, Policy Analyst at Development Reimagined, joining us from Kenya and South Africa there. Thanks both so much for your time and insight on Africa Trade Brief. Let's take a look at how African markets and currencies are performing now.